Hello, New York Giants fans, and welcome to the Valentine's Views podcast here on YouTube. Please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Today is Monday, and it is our post-mortem of the Giants' 21-18 loss to the Washington Commanders on Sunday, a loss that dropped the Giants to 0-2. And here to help me do that, as always, the day after games is Big Blue Views' Tony DelGenio. Morning, Tony. How are you?
Morning, Ed. I'm doing well, thanks.
Tony, you and I are old. All right, that's not a news flash. All right,
you and I getting older quickly.
you and I are old. The Giants are making us older. That is one of the weirdest football games I think the NFL has ever seen. That Giants Commanders game. We just have to start there. That was from the opening kickoff all the way through, that was a weird football game.
Absolutely. I don't think I have ever seen a game quite like that. And I have a feeling that the Green Bay Packers center must have watched the game too, because he threw up on the ball during the game just before.
Oh my God! Did you? That was just so ridiculous. I remember I saw that on social media last night. And they asked Malik Willis why he didn't throw the ball. And he said, well, I couldn't because the center threw up on it. Oh, my God.
And you can see that in the clip.
Yes, you can. It was just I've never seen anything quite so bizarre. But last night's, the Giants game, one of the craziest things ever. First time in NFL history that a team has scored 3 touchdowns, not allowed a touchdown, and lost a game in regulation. I think it's, there was a number. I think it's the first time, not only did Austin Seibert kick 7 field goals, I think it's the first time anyone has ever kicked 5 field goals in a game from inside 30 yards against the Giants. There's just so many truly bizarre numbers that come out of that game. I'm sitting there last night and I'm thinking the way that the last decade has gone for the Giants, the way Sunday went, and I'm thinking, do these kinds of things only happen to the Giants, to this version of the Giants? It's crazy.
I know, it's unbelievable, but I mean, in some sense, they caused their own demise.
Absolutely.
With the game day personnel decisions that they make. And this
game day personnel decisions, right? And that's where we need to start. We need to start with the Graham Gano decision, which when he popped up on the injury report on Saturday, that was a red flag. Popped up on the injury report with a groin issue. I was not among the reporters in Landover, Maryland on Sunday, but some of the reporters who were there said that Gano struggled during warmups, had to go back inside. I don't know if he got a shot, if he got retaped or whatever, but he went back inside, looked a little bit better, lasted 1 play. And of course, we know, I mean, he pulls a hamstring trying to chase down Austin Eckler on a play that wound up basically not counting. And again, does this stuff only happen to the New York Football Giants? I don't know, but there was some question of whether the reporters were correct in basically peppering Brian Daboll with questions about the Gano decision. And I absolutely believe they were right. Look, the guy was hurt. They have a kicker on the practice squad. You enter the game with a guy is not 100% and no contingency plan. And it's bad enough that this is once, but this was the same thing they did last week with Gunnar Olszewski. They did this last year with Graham Gano, going too far into the season with him before shutting him down. We talked last week about the weirdness of Cordale Flott playing more snaps in the slot than Drew Phillips. something we saw Sunday that was ridiculous because of the way Phillips played. We talked last year about using Josh Azudu at left tackle with no practice. It would be different if this was a one-time thing, but it's over and over and over where you find game day roster decisions and personnel usage that are coming back to haunt this team. It's been going on for 2 years. And I don't know, Tony, it leads me to wonder if they're learning from their own mistakes.
I think that's a very fair question to ask. I mean, about the specific issue of Graham Gano, yes, it was his groin that had been bothering him, not his hammy. And I get that. But the fact is, his groin was bothering him during the week and up to game time and practice. They could have had a replacement kicker ready that they could have elevated just before the game, once they knew that his hammy wasn't, or they knew that his groin wasn't in great shape. And the question they're not asking themselves is, what if something happens to this guy? And I would argue that when you're talking about I guess it's 51 guys that you can actually have active for the game, right? 51.
It was 40. It's 48.
40. I'm sorry. 48,
and the way let me just clarify the way it works. They would have had to elevate Jude McAtomney by 4:00 on Saturday. They would have had to elevate him. Now, 90 minutes before the game is when you set your inactives. So they could have elevated McAtomney and then chosen which kicker after warmups, or had both kickers active for the game. Instead, they elevated 2 linebackers, elevated Tomon Fox, and left themselves without a contingency. So I just want to clarify all of that. So I mean, if you had more of a point to make on that, go ahead.
Yeah. The other point that I was going to make about that was having someone, a healthy kicker and punter, by the way, on the roster at game time, I think is an important thing to do, because unlike other positions, let's say, okay, so they elevated Tomon Fox, and you can make do. You can change the type of defense you play or the type of offense you play, what personnel you send out there, and so on, right? I mean, there's all kinds of personnel groupings on offense and defense. There's nickel, there's dime, there's straight 4-3, there's traditional 3-4, blah blah blah. Right? There's all of that stuff. You've got 1-1 personnel, 1-2 personnel, 2-2 personnel. So you have lots of ways you can mix and match the other players on the roster if you actually get a guy hurt and have to put someone else in. But if your kicker gets hurt, then you have no choice, right? And
right.
And either they thought that they could get it from someone else, or they didn't. And when they had to get an extra point without their regular kicker in there, they had one failed attempt, and then they said, nope, we're not going to kick the rest of the game. And so they're doing things like that, I believe, too often. They're also, and this is just one, I think, example of what I think is a larger problem with this regime, and that is that guys wind up getting buried on the depth chart for reasons that are not at all clear, I think, to those of us looking on from the outside. And maybe they don't have to be. They might have very good reasons for doing it. But there are several players on this roster who were thought at one time to play major roles on the team, who are hardly seeing the field now. And we saw some of that last week with Isaiah Simmons. We've seen it for 2 games in a row with Jalen Hyatt. I want to talk about Daniel Bellinger, who looked like he was going to be a star in his first year in the NFL before he had that eye injury. But now he only played 4 snaps yesterday on the field. And it's not as if the Giants have all pro tight ends ahead of him, right? They've got Theo Johnson, who is a guy that they're high on, but who didn't get targeted at all yesterday. And then they've got a blocking tight end, Chris Manhurst, and both of them saw the field significant number of snaps, and Bellinger was hardly out there at all. And so there are lots of different examples of of guys not seeing the field on this team, or hardly seeing the field, that I have to scratch my head about, because it's not as if the guys that they are putting out there are clearly doing so much better than them that they deserve to be buried on the depth chart. And yet it's happening. And so I find that a curious thing. And Daboll, unfortunately, is just one of those head coaches who chooses not to be communicative to the press, and tries to kind of evade answers to everything. And I'm not saying he's got to be a Mike McDaniel or somebody like that who entertains the press every time he talks, but he's very defensive about the choices that he makes, and doesn't really seem to have a good reason for them.
Right. It's interesting in terms of the kicker situation. The 19 special teams snaps that Tomon Fox played were definitely not worth the points, the potential points that not having a second kicker cost the Giants after Graham Gano got hurt. The lack of contingency plan is a problem. I would like, and we'll talk to Brian Daboll later on today, for the second straight week, Jalen Hyatt got the short end of the stick when it came to wide receiver snaps. The Giants are playing a lot of 12 personnel, and they're using Theo Johnson and Chris Manhertz at the expense of Daniel Bellinger and at the expense of Jalen Hyatt, to be honest with you. I mean, what it comes down to, I think, is Darius Slayton is better than Jalen Hyatt. And the way that the Giants are playing, all four guys can't be on the field. They love what Wan'Dale Robinson does in the slot. Malik Nabers is not coming off the field. So if Jalen Hyatt's on the field, Darius Slayton probably is off the field. And I don't think the Giants are comfortable with that. But it is weird. What's happened to Bellinger is weird. And listen, I'm not one who, even at 0-2, even the way last year went, even with some of these things that we're talking about, I am not at that point yet where I want John Mara and Steve Tisch to go blow this thing up. All right, I'm not there. And yet I want some recognition from this regime. And Brian Daboll said it's collaborative when they set the roster for game day. It's collaborative between himself and Joe Shane. I want some recognition that they need to take a look at some of these decisions that they're making and leave themselves better contingency plans. I mean, the thing last week, the problem that I had last week wasn't even so much relying on Olszewski. The problem that I had last week was they had several weeks and they did workouts involving punt returners. They still don't have, I mean, they signed a new punt returner, but they still don't have a second one anywhere. They still don't have one on the practice squad. They still don't have a contingency plan at that position. And that bothers me. Learn something. Look at your decisions and learn from your mistakes. And I'm not sure I'm not sure this regime is doing that at this point.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And if I can just circle back to Graham Gano one more time, the other thing that I don't think anyone is talking about yet, but really should be talked about, is that this is the second year in a row that Graham Gano has suffered an injury and cost them a game because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Not that it's his fault. He's not the one deciding who plays and who doesn't, but unless he tells them he can't go. But the fact is, Graham Gano has had a great career, but he's getting on in years. And when you're injured 2 years in a row, is it really time for the Giants to be looking into a new kicker permanently? And I think that's a discussion we need to have.
That's a fair point, and one that 2 years in a row with a 37-year-old kicker. It's a fair discussion, and we'll see. I would anticipate, by the way, considering groin issue and now a hamstring, I can't see how Graham Gano doesn't wind up on IR, at least temporarily. Whether the Giants go out and get another kicker or whether they trust, McAtomney to see how that goes for a couple of weeks, we'll find out. But I have to anticipate Gano spending some time on IR. Tony, I want to ask you. We're talking a little bit about Brian Daboll. Joe Schoen gets wrapped into that discussion. How did you feel about Brian Daboll being asked last night about whether he felt like his job was in jeopardy? I don't know. I still think that you've got to give this regime time this season, see if it doesn't go completely off the rails in terms of guys being unhappy. But I would still like to see this regime given a chance to draft its own quarterback. But how did you feel about Daboll being asked about his job status, and do you feel like he's coaching his way into maybe losing his job?
So I guess I'll say a couple of things. First, I know it's a provocative question, but I don't think it's unfair for him to get that question based on what happened last year and how this season has begun, because they've had 2 losses to teams that they might have been expected or at least had a chance to beat. Although that having been said, while we weren't looking yesterday, the Minnesota Vikings beat the San Francisco 49ers, and their defense held San Francisco to 7 points until there were about 10 and a half minutes left in the game. So that defense of Minnesota, I think, is for real. And so I think Minnesota is a better team than most of us gave them credit for being heading into the season. But that's a different topic. I think, though, it's fair for him to get that question when they start the season this way. And I think it would be stupid to pull the plug on this regime this quickly. And I think this is something that the Giants have done over and over and over again. The fact is that when did the Giants ever have a head coach in recent memory who wasn't under fire, wasn't in risk of losing his job? Ray Perkins, he was good right off the bat, and then he wound up leaving before he completed the job. But Bill Parcells went 3-12-1 his first season, and he turns out to be one of the greatest Giant head coaches of all time. Tom Coughlin, after the 2006 season, the Giants almost got rid of him because he was getting them to the playoffs and not any further, and the players hated him for all his rules and his stern nature, and he changed and they wound up winning. But even in 2007, they didn't wind up winning until they lost 2 games terribly and almost lost a third one. So I think we have plenty of lessons from the past that you shouldn't give up on a head coach too early, a coach who seems to be capable in other ways. And I don't think Brian Daboll is like the terrible head coaches in the Giants past. He's not Ray Handley, right? He's
not Joe Judge to me.
Not Joe Judge, right? And so on and so forth, right? And so there are a lot of things that I think he is good at, and I think he's terrible in how he deals with the press. And as we've just discussed, I think he has a lot to learn about how to make game day personnel decisions, and maybe Joe Schoen is part of that as well. But I think that unless this season really becomes a disaster, I think you've got to stick with both of them for another year and have some stability at that position. And if you think opposite, then I would ask you to put yourself in the position of another person in the NFL that is looking for a head coaching job and is at all desirable to several teams. Why would you possibly take the Giants' job if you see the kind of instability that they have in the franchise, constantly getting rid of head coaches every couple of years? You're a good head coaching candidate. People talk about the offensive coordinator, Ben Johnson, I guess is from Detroit. Is that his name, Ben Johnson? I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
He was a hot candidate for a head coaching job. He chose not to leave last year. Well, let's say he chooses this year to leave. Are the Giants a team he's going to want to move to, seeing what they've done to head coaches in their recent past? I don't think so. So they're going to wind up getting one of these kind of second tier candidates if they do, someone that they can only hire because that guy doesn't have any other job offers anywhere. And so they have to kind of, I think, redevelop a reputation as a competent franchise before they do anything like that. And I think that unless Daboll really forces the issue by being just ridiculously bad this year, I think they've got to stick with him.
Yeah, Tony, we're getting a couple of comments and questions about Brian Daboll and basically about the way that he treats the press and about the short answers and all of that. And listen, Brian Daboll is not Joe Judge. Joe Judge gave an 11-minute answer in a press conference once. He gave a 6-minute answer to a question that I asked him once. And basically, those answers were not directed at the media. They weren't directed at the fan base. They were directed at John Mara, and they were long-winded pleas for him to get to keep his job. Brian Daboll is a nice guy. He's a good guy. Players love Daboll. Thing about Brian Daboll is he comes from the Bill Belichick, Nick Saban school when it comes to the media. And it's not like he dislikes us, okay? You can see that when we step away from the microphone. Brian Daboll is simply up there, and his job isn't to give us reams of information. His job is to parry our questions. It's like a tennis match. His job is to parry our question, hit it back over the net without telling us anything. That's exactly how he sees it. His job is to parry the question and not tell us anything. And as much as I hate it, as much as it drives me insane, because I would love one good sentence of explanation sometimes, that's how he sees it. His job is to just not give us anything. So, so that's how it is. It's not because he's uncomfortable. It's because that's what he intends to do, is not tell us anything. And that's okay.
Yeah, and there seems to be a whole school of that. You mentioned Bill Belichick, right? Who's famous for being a curmudgeon in press conferences. But you look at him now that he's at least momentarily retired, and he's on Pat McAfee, he's on the Manning cast, and he's perfectly personable and talkative when he's in that format. It's just that when he's a head coach, he does basically the same thing that Daboll does. Yeah,
absolutely, Tony. Let's move on. Let's talk about the other elephant in the room when it comes to the first two games and when it comes to the Giants losing on Sunday. But this Giants defense at this point is a problem. This Giants defense made Sam Darnold in week 1 look like something we didn't think he was. And now, yes, Sam Darnold and the Vikings just went and beat the San Francisco 49ers. So maybe you give Kevin O'Connell, Minnesota's coach, and Sam Darnold more credit than maybe we thought they deserved. But one of the most ridiculous numbers from Sunday was Washington being 0 for 6 in the red zone, and by extension 0 for 3 in goal-to-go situations. Now, Shane Bowen, Giants defensive coordinator, has a reputation for having defenses that are good in the red zone. Statistically, the Giants can pound their chest and say, hey, we kept them out of the end zone. We have 0 for 6, yada, yada, yada. The reality of it is that had very little to nothing to do with the New York Giants. and a whole lot to do with the penalties and failings of the Commanders once they got down there. The bigger problem for me was that Washington scored every time it had the ball. They ran at least 9 plays every time they had the ball. The Giants consistently failed on third down, all sorts of penalties, all sorts of 3rd and 13, 3rd and 14, where they're giving up the first downs. And I don't know. I don't even know what to say, because had Washington been a good football team, Washington probably would have scored 35 points or more on Sunday.
Yeah, and so I'll give Jaden Daniels some credit. I mean, obviously he hasn't figured out how to be a quarterback from the passing standpoint yet at the NFL level, and he's having, I think, trouble, the usual troubles you'd expect of a rookie on that side. But he's definitely a weapon with his legs, and he's already, I think, well above average in that aspect of the game, and he caused problems for the Giants yesterday in that regard. But the Giants' run defense for the second week in a row, especially the interior run defense, is awful. And I mean, even with Dexter Lawrence on the field, I don't think the run defense was good yesterday. I might be wrong. We'll see what we see later in the stats, but certainly when Dexter Lawrence wasn't on the field, Washington just gashed the Giants in the running game all day, and the Giants, there was just nothing that they could do about it. And my gut feeling is that the Giants linebackers played very poorly. I mean, I think they made a lot of tackles, but I think a lot of those tackles might have been 5 or 6 or more yards.
Well, I looked at Micah McFadden had 13 tackles, and yet I can't think of an impact play that he made. So yeah, so I hear you.
Yeah, he did have a sack of Jaden Daniels. That was one sack play. But I mean, and obviously the most ridiculous play of all is this play where they had the Washington running back stacked up at the line of scrimmage, and he just bounces off and goes for 40 yards after that. And it's very concerning. I mean, they're not getting enough pressure. Let's say, I won't say a lot or whatever. They're not getting enough pressure from their defensive line. I mean, they did sack Jaden Daniels a few times yesterday, but it was the defensive backs that sacked him, and again, won by McFadden, not the edge defenders. So I think that that's something that is really a concern. And when they start playing good quarterbacks, I think they're really in danger of having a team really run up the score on them unless something changes.
Absolutely, it's very concerning. Most of those sacks came when Daniels had broken the pocket, tried to get out. Guys came up and made plays. That's how you wound up with Jason Pinnock and McFadden and I think Drew Phillips. Even Bobby Okereke as well. That's how those sacks occurred, was mostly, when Daniels had broken the pocket. But Shane Bowen said it last week. If this defense is going to be good, Dexter Lawrence, Kayvon Thibodeau, and Brian Burns have to be dominant. And to this point, the two edge guys just haven't been that. I know that Kayvon Thibodeau had some advanced stats that looked pretty good on Sunday, but you've got to make plays, and it's just the guys they need to make plays to this point, especially those two edge guys, just aren't getting it done. And Bowen said in training camp, he said one of the things we talk about basically is not doing stupid stuff that hurts your football team. In over 2 weeks, how many times, forget the missed tackles, forget the missed assignments, all of that stuff, how many times have the Giants given up first downs on 3rd and long when they would have gotten off the field because of a stupid penalty. When it's 3rd and long, don't grab the guy. Make the quarterback complete the pass. If you're beaten by a step, you're beaten by a step, but don't give the opposition a first down. And the Giants are consistently, beating themselves on defense, and it's discouraging.
Yeah. And again, it's early in the season, so
Right.
time for them to turn around. They are learning a new defense under a new defensive coordinator, and so in the back of my mind, I try to remind myself that and say, again, I'll go back to the 2007 team. Not that this team is anything like the 2007 team, but the 2007 team not only lost their first 2 games and almost lost a third, but they gave up, I believe, 35 and 45 points in their 2 losses at the beginning of the season, and that's a team that's considered one of the great Giants defenses of all time, right? And
Right.
that defense was the number 1 reason that they won the Super Bowl that year. They weren't an offensively dominating team that year. The defense won a lot of their games for them, right? And the regular season and the playoffs, but they started off the season looking absolutely terrible 2 games in a row against Dallas and Green Bay. So I try to remind myself that there's time for things to change, and maybe as the players get more used to what Shane Bowen's defense is doing, things will improve. But at the same time, I don't think I see as many great players on that Giants defense as I want to see, especially up front. And
Absolutely.
so it's a real concern. Next week, I guess they luck out because I think, right, Nick Chubb is out with an injury. Is that right? And so they maybe Cleveland and Deshaun Watson has never returned to the form that he had in Houston. And so uh, I don't know that Cleveland is as imposing a team as people might have imagined that they would be right now. But at some point, that defense has to come alive and start helping them win games.
Absolutely. Tony, I just, speaking of, you used the word, great players and all of that. And just got to talk about Malik Nabers for a minute. I mean, he was terrific on Sunday. 10 catches, lots of yards after catch, and 18 targets, fantastic game. And then he goes and drops a ball that might have put the Giants in position to win a game. And I only say might because they still probably would have had to score a touchdown.
Yeah.
Considering their kicker situation. But I mean, I felt bad for the kid, and yet, he showed you all of the reasons why the Giants drafted him 6th overall, and why, fingers crossed that he stays healthy, why he's going to be a terrific player in this league for a long time.
Yep, I think there can be no doubt in the minds of Giants fans that he was the correct pick at number 6 if they were not going to go quarterback. And if you still want to argue that they should have taken one of the quarterbacks who remained, that's certainly a fair opinion to have. But if they weren't going to go quarterback, then it might be that all 3 of the guys that they might have been thinking about at that point are going to turn out to be great players. Marvin Harrison Jr. went off yesterday with a big game, but Malik Nabers, after 2 games, is the 3rd leading receiver in the NFL in yards over 2 games. Okay, not among rookies, but among all receivers, and so he's off to just a great start. And I really feel for him. I'm thrilled with how he took the blame on himself yesterday after the game. Because you want to see players who rightly or wrongly, at least realize that it does the team no good for them to point fingers at someone else. And there were many reasons the Giants lost that game. It shouldn't have come down to the Malik Nabers play, right? And so he didn't lose that game for them, but that play did play a part in them losing the game, and he just expressed regret about it and put the blame on himself for that. And I thought that's a pretty mature thing for a rookie to do, and especially a rookie that some people wondered about, that he had an edge to him and might be a disruptive influence or something like that. Well, you know what? He's behaving very maturely.
Absolutely. Tony, before we wrap up, really, we probably should spend a minute or two talking about Daniel Jones coming off of the miserable week 1 game. I thought Jones was really good on Sunday. To me, people will say, and people in comments at Big Blue View and in the Big Blue View X account have said, oh, but he only threw for 178 yards and the Giants only scored, 18 points or whatever. Well, with a kicker, they score more points than that. Without the drop at the end of the game, they score more points than that. Without the Devin Singletary fumble, they probably go down the way that drive was going. They probably go down and get up and score and take a double or a 2-score lead. Nothing that went wrong yesterday was on Daniel Jones.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, go ahead. Nothing that went wrong with yesterday was on Daniel Jones.
So so all the things that you mentioned, you put them all together, and naturally you can't assume a touchdown on the last 2 things that you mentioned. But if they had gotten touchdowns on those other 2 drives, then you're talking about Jones putting 35 points up on the board, even just with a kicker in the game who could make extra points in fairly short field goals. You're talking about at least a 27-point game rather than an 18-point game. And so at a minimum, they should have won that game 27-21 yesterday. Daniel Jones yesterday led the NFL in EPA per play.
Which, in case people don't know, that's expected points added per play.
Yeah, and that's sort of considered the gold standard in how you evaluate quarterback play. So he was not the reason, and people will look at the misses, and he had 2 deep shots that he took that he overthrew. And he could have thrown those passes better. But I watched other games yesterday on the NFL besides just the Giants game, and I saw other quarterbacks doing the same thing. I saw Joe Burrow in the game against Kansas City overthrow, I think, Jamar Chase, I think it was, by 10 yards or something like that. So other quarterbacks do that too, but people just look for whatever they can criticize about Jones to fail to admit that he ever does anything good. And he absolutely deserved it last week. He played awful last week.
Mm-hmm.
No one can defend that.
No.
But he had a very good game yesterday, and it's not his fault that they only put 18 points on the board.
No, and it's not Daniel Jones' fault that the defense couldn't stop anybody. That it's not Daniel Jones' fault that the Giants' offense was only on the field for 22 minutes. You're not going to put up 300 passing yards when you're on the field for 22 minutes, when the other team's on the field for 38, when they're chewing up, time and when they're chewing up the game with 16 play drives and 14 play drives, and I think, 7 drives overall that were 9 plays or more. You're just not going to put up huge yardage and gaudy stats when that's the case. But none of that is me sitting here saying, oh, he showed that he deserves to be the quarterback for forever and ever and ever and ever. It's just an acknowledgement that he played well yesterday and did his job, and that's as far as that goes.
Right. They only punted twice yesterday, and so that's not a bad. I mean, I don't think he had a tremendous game. I don't think when we see the PFF grades. He's going to grade 90 or anything like that. But I think that he had a good game. And as you say, they only had the ball 7 times. And he got 3 touchdowns out of that, 2 turnovers, 1 on downs when Nabers
2 turnovers in scoring position.
Scoring position, right? One when
Right.
Nabers dropped the pass at what, the 10-yard line? He would have, I think.
That was, I don't know exactly where it was, but it was somewhere in that neighborhood. Yes.
Yeah, and then Singletary fumbled at, I think, the 30-yard line or something like that. So he had them in scoring position 5 times. They only punted twice. And he, other than the 2 turnover plays, neither of which were his fault, they scored the other 3 times, and they scored touchdowns the other 3 times. And so I don't think he gets any of the blame for that.
No.
Yes.
No. Anyway, Tony, 0-2, not where the Giants wanted to be, not really where most of us expected them to be looking at the first 2 games of the schedule. Doesn't get easier next week. They go to Cleveland. I think they're 6.5-point underdogs. That offense isn't great in Cleveland, but that defense is considered one of the best, if not the best, in the NFL. So the Giants aren't going to have much margin for error in Cleveland. And the one thing I will say is they return home week 4 against the Dallas Cowboys. And I shudder at the thought of how ugly it's going to be in MetLife Stadium if they come back on a Thursday night 0-3 and put up a stinker against the Cowboys in MetLife Stadium. I just shudder at how ugly it's going to be.
I don't know why you feel that way. When has that ever happened?
Gee, did I imagine Daniel Jones in the offense being booed 3 plays into the season opener? Did I imagine that? Anyway, Tony, I think that's a good place for us to wrap it up for this week. Giants fans, thank you as always for listening. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.